Chapter 10. The secret behind the scenes where people have never been taken before. Tour of the Super Tzadik. That's knocking on the door of the Super Tzadik. That's what we're looking to do this evening. So if you have the Tanya book, we're on page 42. That's page numbers at the bottom of the page. And those of you who are watching online, we're going to pop it onto the screen right now. So in the book, you are looking towards the end of the page. V'hein heim. It's about 7 lines from the bottom of the page. And it is the second word on the line. V'hein. V'hein heim. So just to put this into context, last week what we ended off with was that there are many different types of, it's a broad spectrum, many types of tzaddikim that are out there. And they obviously, what distinguishes one tzaddik from the next is how much or to what extent they are able to obliterate and neutralize the negativity in their lives. And we said that there are literally, he uses the expression, 18,000 types of tzaddikim in front of Hashem. And all of them fall into the category, the broad category that we've been discussing, which is the so-called imperfect tzaddik. The tzaddik who is ra loi, still has some kind of negativity in the system, but that negativity is overwhelmed by the positive. That's where we got up to last time. So let's just read that line. The variations of how much a tzaddik is able to neutralize the negative in their life, that's what determines the difference between various tzaddikim. As the Gemara tells us, that there are 18,000 tzaddikim before Hashem. Doesn't indicate if that's at one time or if that's various categories, but the point is there are many different types of imperfect tzaddikim. So last week we thought that we were going to get past that section and we were actually going to talk about the perfect tzaddik as well, which we didn't. So here we are this week. Ach. You see that? Ach. So it's now the fifth last line on the page. Ach, the first word on the line. Amal tzaddik gomer. If you want to really understand what the uniqueness is, what the elevated position of a perfect tzaddik is, why don't we ask one? Wouldn't that be nice? Would you like to secure an interview with a perfect tzaddik? For those people who are not sitting in the room, we have somebody in the room who's giving non-verbal communication that his wife is a perfect tzaddik. That's which is very good. We'll convey his sentiment at an appropriate time. So the best way to find out what a perfect tzaddik is ask one. What's it like? Imagine doing such an interview. So tell me, Rabbi so-and-so, Mr. So, Rebbetzin so-and-so, what's it like to be a perfect tzaddik? Can you just imagine how that conversation is going to go? It'd be strange, right? Okay, so I'm going to tell you all about it. I'm going to tell you what it's like. It's not really what you would expect from a tzaddik, let alone from a perfect tzaddik. So where are we going to find an insight into what a perfect tzaddik is? So one of the places that we could look is we have, of course we have a long list of people who qualify as tzaddikim, as deeply pious individuals, people who have conquered their spiritual demons and so on. But there are some outstanding personalities who really are a cut above the rest, and they definitely belong to a category of unique tzaddikim, and some of them did us a favor of writing on the subject. So who wrote on the subject? Let's read on. Hu she'omar Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. Heard of him? Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. So it's not really like Ba'omer time, otherwise Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai would be on top of everybody's minds. But Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai was this outstanding personality, an incredibly advanced tzaddik, who wrote about the tzaddik gomer, some kind of a description of a tzaddik gomer. Interesting question. Somebody's asking, does a perfect tzaddik know that they are a perfect tzaddik? It's a really interesting question. And I'm going to simplify it by saying yes. Yes, they would know that they're a perfect tzaddik. And it wouldn't affect them in any way. It wouldn't prejudice them in any way. It wouldn't go to their heads, but they would have that awareness. Okay, so Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. Now, let's just do a little bit of biography on the personality that we're about to quote, because everybody knows Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai was a great man. That everybody knows. People also know that there's an association between Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai in Lag BaOmer, because that's the day of his Yortzeit. So if you're in Israel on Lag BaOmer, as some people would love to do, so if you're in Israel on his Yortzeit, and Lag BaOmer, there are literally hordes, tens of thousands of people who converge on Meron, on the burial place of the Arizal, and all over the entire country, people have their big bonfires for Lag BaOmer, and they sing about Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, and they talk about the greatness of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. So he's a legendary figure. Now, the problem with legendary figures is that we usually don't know too much about them. We know the legends. We don't necessarily know too much about them, right? There's sometimes, we use the expression sometimes of a hidden tzaddik. So everybody thinks a hidden tzaddik is some person who's anonymous in the community. And they do such a good job of hiding their righteousness and their piety that they could literally sit next to you in shul and you'd think they're a hobo. In the meantime, they're a tzaddik, which is possible. But sometimes a hidden tzaddik means that their piety is so profound that even if you were staring them in the face, you wouldn't be able to understand it. Meaning you could understand that they're a tzaddik, you can identify that they're a pious individual, but the degree of that piety, the degree of that holiness is so beyond us that even when we're staring it in the face, we have no idea what it is that we're looking at. So Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai perhaps falls into that category because we know a lot about him and we know nothing about him simultaneously. So let's try and piece together a little bit. What do we know? What do we know about Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai? I don't know. What do you know about Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai? What do we know? So I'll tell you one thing that everybody generally knows about Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is that he was a fugitive from the Romans because there was a gathering of the rabbis and he didn't speak so glowingly of the Roman achievements in Israel, and he spoke about their self-interest, and of course the news got back to the Romans. They didn't like it too much. They put a price on his head, and so Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and his son had to go and hide, and they spent 12 years in a cave hidden from the Romans, and then eventually came out and they had such a spiritual experience that they couldn't relate to the world. They had to go back into the cave for another year to almost rehabilitate and bridge their experience with the experience of regular human beings. That's the story most people know. But here are one or two other stories that people don't necessarily know about Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. First of all, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the expression that is used to describe him is Man Penei Ha'adon Hashem, who is the face of God in the world, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Can you imagine making such a statement? Imagine. That's an indication of what kind of a personality he is. You look at Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and you can literally almost like see what godliness is, because he was that much dedicated. He was that at that level of piety. So he's an incredibly unique human being, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. So this is what Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai had to say about perfect tzaddikim. What he had to say about perfect tzaddikim. For those of you who are on the screen, you have to realize when a guy walks into the room, as has just happened, carrying a new bottle of Glenlivet, all the people in the room think that he is a perfect tzaddik. So just for the context of what's just happening over here in the room. So in any event, so Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who's this incredible human being, is literally at another level. He's such a great person. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, you ask the question, does a perfect tzaddik know that he's a perfect tzaddik? Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai uses this expression where he says, I have the capacity to excuse the entire world from any negative judgment that might be raised against them. In other words, he understood how much power, spiritual power, that he had. We say, our tradition says, Kedai hu Rabbi Shimon lismoy cholav v'shas adchak, that if people are in a crisis, you could rely on Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai all these centuries later, after he had passed away. You could still rely on him to get you out of a pickle, to get you out of a difficult situation. He said, I have the power to mitigate any negative judgment against the entire world. I can take the whole world on my shoulders. It's a powerful statement, right? You don't find too many rabbis saying that. Certainly not nowadays. And like I say, still till today, everybody knows whether it's like BaOmer or it's not like BaOmer. If you can daven at Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's grave, it's very powerful and miracles happen, and they happen consistently. He's an incredible human being. So Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says as follows. He's going to introduce us to a new phrase to refer to the perfect tzaddik. And from here until the end of the chapter, we're going to try and unpack this phrase. And we're going to do so from two angles. So this evening, we'll focus on the one angle, and then, please God, next time, we'll focus on the second angle. So what does he say? Hu she'omer Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. The definition of what a perfect tzaddik is phrased by Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai as follows. Ra'isi, I have seen B'nai Aliyah. Okay, here's our new phrase. B'nai Aliyah, we'll talk about that in a moment. V'heim mu'atim chulei, and they are extremely rare. And then he goes on to a list and he says, if there might be so many of them in the world, they're the following people. And if there's only two of them in the world, then it's my son Rabbi Eliezer and myself. And then eventually says, and if there's only one, it's me. Right? Which is interesting, because you would normally anticipate that somebody who's such a great tzaddik would not speak about themselves in, these complimentary and perhaps in this case even superlative terms. But that's because a tzaddik of that caliber is just absolute truth. There's no playing for the cameras. There's no worrying about maybe you're going to think that I'm an arrogant person because I'm telling you like it is. I remember once hearing a line from a very wise rabbi who said, there's nothing more arrogant than the person who avoids saying something in case people think he's arrogant for saying it. In other words, if you think about it, the person who doesn't want to say something because you're going to think I'm arrogant is obviously very worried about their own image. So that's why they don't want to say it. So the person who's a perfect tzaddik who knows that what they're saying is absolute truth, why should I be embarrassed to say what's the truth? Okay, that doesn't mean that every person who runs around telling us amazing things about themselves is a tzaddik. The likelihood is most of those people are probably delusional, and occasionally there'll be a tzaddik. In any event, so Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai uses this expression B'nai Aliyah, and we have to unpack what this expression means. Now, of course, we know in Hebrew that the word ben, what is ben? That's the singular, B'nai is the plural, so what's ben? Son. Son, right? We also know that in Hebrew, very often when we use the word ben, we don't necessarily mean child. I'll give you an example, right? Let's start with an easy example. If I talk about somebody who visits you regularly and they feel like they're a part of the family, then in Hebrew we'll call that person ben bayis. It means they're like a son in your home. But obviously this has nothing to do with their yichus, that's got nothing to do with their family ties. We're not going to start claiming that they are part of your family in the literal sense. Ben bayis means that they now have the title, they have the rights as if they were part of the family. In other words, that indicates to us that sometimes ben is an indicator of a particular designation. Right? So ben bayis, this person is designated as part of the family. Let's use another example. Can you think of another example? Anything that you've ever come across with the word ben that's not ben so-and-so? Okay? So I'll give you a couple of interesting examples from Talmudic literature, because usually rabbis in the Talmud are introduced with their name and often with their father's name. Right? Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. Bar is the Aramaic version of ben. Okay? But sometimes you get people and you realize that can't really be their name. Like the Mishnah that tells us about somebody called Ben Hey. I don't think his father's name was Hey. Or Ben Bug, actually in the same Mishnah. Or at least according to some versions. Other versions split them into two Mishnahs. Ben Bug. So what do you think his father's name was Bug? If that was a popular Jewish name a couple of centuries ago, you'd think there'd at least be somebody in your family tree that was Bug. But there isn't. There's just this one Ben Hey and there's one Ben Bug. So that indicates that those are not real names, rather it's a designation. So Hey, the letter Hey, has the value of 5. Ben Hey is a designation of somebody who, in whatever spiritual way that they had developed, they are represented by the number 10. Ben Hey. Okay, Bug actually is similar because it's the gematria. I don't want to get too technical. Here, somebody put a really good example in the chat. Ben Bris. Ben Bris means somebody who is your ally, somebody who has made a covenant with you. It's a designation. You belong to the same covenant. I'll tell you an interesting one, although it's a little unfair because his name isn't really Ben, but Joshua in the Torah, in the scriptures, right? Joshua is Yehoshua bin. So that's why it's a little unfair, because it's not Ben, it's Bin. But Bin Nun, the son of Nun. What do you think? His father's name was Nun. So there's a whole slew of different commentaries on what Nun represents, and that's his designation. So Nun, for example, represents the number 50, which represents the ultimate mastery over intellect. So Ben Nun, he was somebody who had that level of understanding of everything that Moshe had taught him. Like I said, Bar is the Aramaic version. So when a kid turns 13, we call him Bar Mitzvah. We don't mean he's now the biological son of a mitzvah. We mean he's now designated with the responsibility to perform mitzvahs. So Bnei Aliyah means the people who belong to a particular status that is called Aliyah. So what's Aliyah? See, it all depends how you pronounce it, right? If you put the emphasis on the end of the word, Aliyah, then you're talking about emigration to Israel. But if you use the word Aliyah, then people won't necessarily be confused that way. So what does Aliyah mean? When you get an Aliyah to the Torah, what does it mean? You what?
Like an honor.
An honor. Well, how do we say it?
Superior.
It's what?
Superior.
Aliyah
Superior.
could be superior, could be,
Elevation.
right? Elevation. That's what it means. So it could therefore represent being superior. So you get an Aliyah to the Torah. How do we say it? We say you get called up to the Torah. In other societies, you get called up to military duty. In our society, you get called up to the Torah. So Aliyah means to be elevated. Bnei Aliyah means people who live in an elevated state. So that's his new phrase to help us contextualize what a perfect tzaddik is. It's not about what a person does or what they avoid doing. It's not only about how they feel about what they do or how they feel about the things that we normally feel a temptation towards or distracted by. Bnei Aliyah, they live in an elevated state. It's almost as if to say they live at a different spiritual altitude to the rest of us. So we're all orbiting at a particular level where in our reality there are daily challenges, things that we have to confront, things that we have to overcome, our mood swings, our financial status, anti-Semitism, the smell of a non-kosher braai. I don't know what the various things are that people have to contend with. And the tzaddik is at a different altitude. In other words, it's like this. When you sit in traffic, which of course is the bane of many people's lives, here in South Africa, people think they sit in traffic. They don't understand what traffic is. You've got to go to places like, I don't know, California, New York, the UK, and then you can start to learn what traffic is. We think we sit in traffic. Oh my gosh, time it, your GPS says time in traffic 9 minutes, and we think, oy vey, the world has ended. Anyhow, imagine a person is stuck in a traffic jam. So you're sitting in a traffic jam. Now, what happens to people in traffic is fascinating. It's fascinating. The different people that you get in traffic. It's absolutely fascinating. You look around you and you watch the different people. It's absolutely fascinating. So you get some people completely at ease. They're very rare. But if you find these people, there are some people who are completely at ease. They're sitting in the traffic, whatever, it's fine. I'm listening to my podcast. I'm listening to my Spotify. I'm good. I don't have to be anywhere. Everything is fine. The vast majority of everybody else is clenching the steering wheel, on edge. Every time somebody moves a drop, they move a few centimeters ahead. They keep thinking that the other lane is moving faster than them. So they're trying to weave this way, that way, They get impatient with the person in front of them if they don't move those 3 centimeters quickly enough. They're cursing, whatever. They're phoning somebody to complain about how bad it is that they're stuck in traffic. Then you get the people who are trying to, cheat the system. Driving in the emergency lane, they're cutting in front of you, they're doing tricks, who knows what. No matter how well behaved you are in the traffic, you're still in the traffic. That means even if you're the calmest driver on earth, the fact is you're in the traffic. Now imagine at the exact moment that you're sitting there in traffic, is exactly the same moment that the International Space Station passes right overhead. How much traffic are they dealing with? I know everybody's going to tell you about all the space junk that's floating around out there. The traffic is not on the agenda for the 6 months that they're in space. There's no such concept as traffic. It doesn't enter their reality. They don't have to decide if I'm going to have to use calming techniques, I'm going to have to do deep breathing behind the wheel, I'm going to have to do a meditation, my Headway app while I'm sitting over there. They don't have to think about any of these things. They don't have to worry, they don't have to put in the GPS. Can you imagine putting in Waze when you're on the International Space Station? How long is it going to take you to get home? You know what I mean? They don't have to do any of these things because they're living in an absolutely different reality where traffic is not a thing. B'nai Aliyah is exactly what Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is trying to tell us about the perfect tzaddik. B'nai Aliyah means they're living in a different realm. It's a different reality. They walk down the same street as we do, having a completely different experience to ours. We walk down the street. 1 second. Maybe I just want to window shop over there. Hang on a second. There's a person who's, I don't know, maybe dressed in a particular way, and you shouldn't really be looking. There's a place that once upon a time used to be my favorite restaurant, and now I keep kosher. Whatever. The tzaddik's walking down the same street. None of that. It's like none of that exists. They're literally tuned in to a different wavelength where the things that are our daily struggles just don't feature. We're sitting in the traffic and they're flying in the space station. So Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says that kind of a person is extremely, extremely rare. V'hei mu'atin, they are the absolute exception to humanity. Let's give you a little example, yeah? Little example. So, they tell a story in the Gemara that there was a very great rabbi, and what he used to do is he used to sit the whole time learning, davening, whatever the case is. So where his yeshiva was, they kind of directed him to sit very near to where the women's mikveh was. So that when the women came out of the mikveh, the first person that they would see would be him. So what was the intention? The intention was that the mindset that a person gets into at the beginning of any process is going to define the reality of that process. So the women wanted to see somebody who had such a holiness about them, so that later on, please God, they would conceive a child. It would be with that picture of somebody so holy in their minds. Now I want to ask you, do you think we should start sending people to set up a little kiosk outside the women's mikveh, It'd be crazy, it'd be ludicrous, it would be, that would be something that is completely inappropriate. But in this rabbi's reality, it was like it didn't mean anything. You know what I'm saying? It was like he was zoned into a different space. Who was walking out and what was going on in their personal lives was absolutely irrelevant to him. All he brought to the space was holiness. For us, we can't relate to that. It was like, come on, that's impossible. Must have been some kind of a strange fetish that he had. No, that is the reality of somebody who's living at a different altitude to us. B'nai Aliyah. Now, the word Aliyah over here has another meaning as well, which is not only equally but even more important. Because what does Aliyah mean? I think you said it, Hilton. What does Aliyah mean?
To ascend.
No, not to ascend. Somebody said it before. To elevate. Who said it? You said it. Rowan said it. Right? That's why he brought the Glen Elevate. So, what's the difference between ascend and elevate? Ascend speaks to you. You ascend. Elevate could be you elevate yourself, or it could be you elevate something else. Right? You know, it's the chap of an elevator is not the fact that it goes up and down the building. The fact of the chap of the elevator is that it takes us up the building, where otherwise we'd be schlepping up so many flights of stairs. So aliyah could mean that they have lifted themselves to this incredibly elevated spiritual space. But more importantly, it means that they've elevated other people or things. Now remember, the context that we've been speaking about so far in this chapter of the distinction between the regular or imperfect tzaddik and the super or perfect tzaddik is that we said that the imperfect tzaddik has elevated himself to an incredible level, to a level that is unimaginable. What we're about to discover is that the perfect tzaddik is a perfect tzaddik because of what he has elevated, not just how he has elevated himself. So let's read on. The reason why Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai refers to these super tzaddikim as people of an elevated reality is because what they succeed in doing is taking things that were previously very negative and toxic and pivoting them and elevating them so that those same things become holy. Let's try and understand what that actually means. What does that actually mean? So one interesting example, which is very much part of the Chabad history, is there was a rough history between the Chabad movement and the French. You familiar with this? What was the story? Basically, the story was that when Napoleon was looking to expand his empire and he thought he would go up against the Russians, the Jews living in Russia were thrilled because life as a Jew in Tsarist Russia was far from pleasant. The regular decrees against them, the Cantonists, where they took the kids and they put them into the army for 15 years to assimilate them into Christianity and into Russian lifestyles, the blood libels, the pogroms, it was terrible. It was terrible. Living under the Tsar was terrible. Napoleon claimed to be this great liberal, who was going to bring emancipation and overthrowing the monarchy and bringing democracy to the shores of Europe and now at this point to Russia. So everybody was chalishing, Napoleon's going to come, it's going to be amazing. The best thing that ever happened to Jewish people since what? Since Matzah. I don't know. Right? Everybody thought it was going to be unbelievable. The Alter Rebbe, the author of the Tanya, founder of the Chabad movement, thought that Napoleon would be disastrous for the Jews. And his argument was that the Jewish world was not ready for a liberal society. And because of the incredible, it's like a spring, because of the incredible pressure that they had lived under for so long, with the release of that pressure, Jews would assimilate at a rate that we had never seen before in history. And he felt that the damage to the Jewish nation under a democratic Europe would actually be worse than it was under the tyrannical leadership that they had spent 2,000 years languishing under. So at the time, there was a major split between the leadership, the spiritual leadership in Russia, and there were those davening for Napoleon's victory, and the Alter Rebbe was davening for his defeat. So came Rosh Hashanah, because we know Rosh Hashanah obviously is what's going to determine everything that will happen for the coming year. And intuitively, the leaders at the time knew that whoever blows the shofar first on Rosh Hashanah, their prayers will be answered, and whichever side they support, the Tsar or Napoleon, that's the side that's going to win. So Reb Shlomo Karliner, who was a colleague of the Alter Rebbe but did not see eye to eye with him on this particular issue, got up very early on Rosh Hashanah morning so that he could race through davening to get to the place where you blow the shofar, so he could blow the shofar and daven that Napoleon should succeed. By the time they weren't living in the same place, him and the Alter Rebbe. By the time he got to the moment when you're supposed to blow shofar, he turned to his Hasidim and he said, the Litvak, because that's how the Alter Rebbe was known. He was originally from Lithuania. So he got in before me. what happened? The Alter Rebbe blew the shofar before davening. So he landed up blowing the shofar first. When Napoleon's troops came into Russia, the Alter Rebbe ran for his life because Napoleon had gotten wind of all of this, and he literally wanted, he had some very dark practices, occultish practices that he was involved in, and he wanted to get some of the Alter Rebbe's personal belongings because he wanted to use that somehow for his occultish practices. So the Alter Rebbe ran, and he insisted that they burn everything before they leave. And the Alter Rebbe actually passed away on the run. So there was always this negative relationship between the Chabad world and the French. So what do Chabad sing at the end of Yom Kippur, one of the crescendos of spirituality of the whole year? We sing a nigun that is called Napoleon's March. It has nothing to do with Napoleon. It wasn't a march that Napoleon necessarily used, but it's called Napoleon's March. What a weird thing, right? You're taking a symbol to represent somebody who was so, like, what we call an oisvarf, somebody who was like so outside of the realm of holiness, and you're going to sing a nigun attributed to him. Not only that, everybody knows very well that one of the things that Chabad likes to sing also is the Maseh. And the Rebbe made a big deal about singing the Maseh. But then the Rebbe said something interesting. He said that sometimes you have an element of klippa, of impurity, that we're able to elevate and transform into holiness. And when that happens, you will see a shift in the original. So what happened at some point after Chabad started to sing the Maseh is actually they added an introductory segment before the anthem, which is quite fascinating. So that was an illustration that the Rebbe used of B'nai Aliyah, of taking something that belonged to the world of impurity and lifting and elevating it into the world of holiness. I'll give you a much more radical example. This is a very radical example. Anybody remember the story of Joshua's spies? Remember the story of Joshua's spies? Okay, what's the story? So basically what happens is the Jews are meant to go and conquer the land of Canaan, and the instruction is that before they go, they have to send spies into Jericho, and those spies have to then get a sense of what the attitude and the mindset of the Canaanite nations is at that time, and then they come out and they're going to tell Joshua exactly how they should go about conquering the city. So he chooses two spies going to Jericho. Where do they stay? Anybody remember where they stayed? So they stayed at the home of a woman called Rachav Hazoina. Rachav, the prostitute. Nice place to pick for a couple of rabbis, yes? Because obviously that's who they were. Who do you think these spies were? They weren't the Marines. They weren't the Army Rangers. They were a couple of Yidelach, that Joshua had chosen. According to some opinions, one of them was Kalev, who had previously been one of the spies the first time around. They were very respectable, dignified, pious individuals. So why did they go stay at her house? It was the last place anybody would think to look for two rabbis. It was the perfect cover story for them. So they stay at Rachav's house. The Gemara tells us that Rachav is rated as one of the most attractive women in history. So she had a thriving thing going on over there. What happens to her after the Jews come in? So her deal was that her family would be spared when the Jews would come in and conquer Canaan. So what happens to Rachav? She marries Joshua. Go figure. B'nai Aliyah, that's what a great, powerful tzaddik might do at times. Pull somebody out of the depths of impurity and elevate them to holiness. And Rachav, afterwards, we told... She saved them. Okay, that was very nice of her that she saved them. That's true. That's a very important part of the story. But doesn't turn her into a holy person, right? She doesn't become what was her name, Matahari or whatever. Just because it doesn't mean that you're a good person. Just because you do your country, whatever, because you're loyal. But later we discover that Rachav even starts to have elements of prophecy. We're told. That's how much Yeshua elevates her and lifts her up. And there are various other stories. We can obviously go on with many, many, many stories. The point is that Bnei Aliyah, the ultimate tzaddik, cannot, and as we've learned throughout this whole chapter, cannot tolerate the fact that we're going to leave the dirt in the dirt. That we're going to leave the pollution polluted. So Bnei Aliyah, the whole work that the tzaddik is going to want to do is to elevate that which is most unconscionable, most, impure, and elevate it to holiness. By the way, on that note, what is the most objectionable animal for a Jewish person? Well, the treifest of the treif for a Jewish person is what? See, we don't even want to say the word. See, everybody hesitates to say the word. Nobody even wants to say the word. Right? P-I-G. Right? Nobody wants to say it. So what do we call it? Chaza. Chazir, which is the original Hebrew word, chazir, we're told, comes from the word choizer, which means to return. Because the ultimate state is that the chaza gets elevated back to holiness. That's the ultimate goal. So Bnei Aliyah are these people who are such powerful tzaddikim that they're not just looking for self-elevation. That's not good enough. I could be the most perfect person in the entire world. It's not good enough. They transform what was absolute negative, what was completely toxic, and they elevate it to become holy. And then he continues. Like the introduction to the Zohar says, and it's almost said as if it was like the script of a conversation. So what does it say? There was an occasion. Rabbi Chia was one of the students of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. It's very interesting because Rabbi Chia is a very different personality to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, even though he's one of his students. And I think we have a few minutes that we can unpack that, so I'll come back to it shortly. So Rabbi Chia wants to elevate himself to, this is like one of these out-of-body soul experiences. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is no longer in this world, and Rabbi Chia is trying to project his neshama into the chamber where Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is. Shama kola. He hears a voice. Now this is the introduction to the Zohar. The Zohar is the book that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai wrote. It's the seminal work of all Jewish mysticism. So in the introduction, they're writing about the greatness of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. So what happens? Rabbi Chia is trying to kind of get himself to experience the neshama of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Shama kola. He hears a voice, nofik v'omar, that announces, Man min choin dichashecha ma'apchon linahira. Are you one of those people who has successfully transformed darkness into light? V'tamin meriru lemiska, and has transformed the taste of bitterness into sweetness. Ad lo yesenacha v'chulei, because without that you cannot enter this space. Okay, let's unpack a little bit of what's going on over here, because it's really fascinating. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is a very unique kind of tzaddik. I mean, we've touched on this already from the beginning of this conversation. He was a very unique kind of tzaddik. But one of the things about Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is, for those people who are familiar, that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai spent his days 24/7 absolutely focused on Torah study. To the extent that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was exempt from prayer because he was so invested in Torah learning. Now I'd like to ask you, how would you like to meet somebody like that? Who's completely 24/7 absolutely immersed in Torah study. Be honest.
Terrified.
Be honest.
Terrified.
So you say terrified. I would say I'm not interested. We'll have nothing to talk about. What am I going to talk to him about?
We're going to see him again.
To see him, okay. Exactly. Right? So Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is what we call Torasoi Umanasoi. His Torah is his full-time occupation to the exclusion of everything else. So you would imagine that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai would be the most unrelatable human being. That's what you'd expect. Because he's completely invested in Torah all the time. Like I say, what do I have to speak to him about? He's not even going to look in my direction. Historically, That's not Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Historically, we discovered that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, there are a number of different stories that illustrate that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was so in touch with the realities of people, not only to the extent that he could relate to them, but that sometimes he was the only person who had a solution to their problems. So, for example, when his son Rabbi Eliezer was scorching people with his spiritual gaze because he thought that they were too invested in materialism and they didn't give enough time to Torah, it was Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai who was able to revive them because he could see the value of what they were doing and how they were living. The Torah tells us that there was, the Gemara tells us that there was a particular scenario where there was a shortcut that people couldn't use because there was a question of impurity in that particular area that honestly was just an inconvenience for people. It wasn't a major emergency. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was the one who came up with a solution that they should be able to clear the place out. Because he related to not just what people need, how to fix it, how to lift the world, how to elevate and transform the world. Now here's the fascinating part. Rabbi Chia, his colleague / student, was a different personality. Rabbi Chia's entire spiritual development was all about engaging with the world and elevating the world that way. Two different personalities. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is floating at a different altitude, completely invested in Torah 24/7, and yet at the same time is lifting and transforming the world. And Rabbi Chia is kind of getting his hands dirty, involved in the world, trying to transform the world to become a holier place. So ostensibly it sounds like they're both very similar characters, just doing it in two different ways. What happens when Rabbi Chia wants his neshama to link up with Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's neshama? They say, whoa, hang on a second. Have you made darkness shine? Have you made bitterness taste sweet? Because if you haven't, you don't belong in the B'nai Aliyah category. That's what a perfect tzaddik is. A perfect tzaddik is not a person who finds a way to shine a light when times are dark. A perfect tzaddik isn't somebody, to put it in the context we could understand. A perfect tzaddik is not somebody who has a good inverter when there's a power outage. A perfect tzaddik finds a way to make the darkness shine. A perfect tzaddik is not somebody who says there are elements of the world that are bitter. We're not talking about painful and difficult. We're talking about spiritually unhealthy. So I'll teach you how to avoid them. A perfect tzaddik says we have to make them sweet. We have to turn the darkness into light, the negative into positive. That's B'nai Aliyah. And that is the definition of this super tzaddik, of this perfect tzaddik. So you want to knock on the door, you want to see behind closed doors, you want to see what the perfect tzaddik is all about and what he's doing. This is what the perfect tzaddik is all about. Cannot tolerate that there's darkness in the world. Cannot tolerate that there's negative in the world. And will not rest until that has changed. Will not rest until it's been transformed. As we've already defined before. Not satisfied to put the criminals behind bars. He wants to make sure there are no more criminals. That people who previously in their previous life were criminals are now great people. Maybe the most beautiful illustration of this would be that there was somebody called Rabbi Yochanan. He was one of the great sages of the Talmud. And he was once bathing in a river, which was obviously what people did in those days, and have running water. They could have lived in Joburg. And there was a very notorious highwayman called Shimon ben Lakish, who comes running past and leaps across the river. And he was known as a very, yeah, exactly. He was known as a very dangerous, very aggressive human being. Rabbi Yochanan takes one look at him and he says, you should start learning Torah. He says, what, me? You're crazy. What? I have nothing to do with Torah. So Rabbi Yochanan was a very good-looking man. He said to Reish Lakish, if you, at that time he was known as Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, well, not Rabbi, Shimon ben Lakish. He said, if you commit yourself to Torah learning, I'll introduce you to my sister. Oh, he was sold. And he became one of the greatest sages of the Talmud. Every time Rabbi Yochanan is quoted, Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, who becomes known as Reish Lakish, is quoted alongside him. Because Rabbi Yochanan could not tolerate the fact that there should be somebody whose soul is caught in the clutches of darkness. Just couldn't tolerate. He had to flip that story. He had to turn it around. That is B'nai Aliyah. That is what it means. People who are, their designation is those who elevate the darkest parts of this world to become light, the most toxic parts of this world to become healthy. That's what a perfect tzaddik is. Please God, next week we'll look at a second definition of what B'nai Aliyah means, Now with that, please God, we'll conclude the chapter.